my name's Danny Siegel, and today we're going to be doing the Champion Briefs topic analysis on the NSDA topic, Resolve the United States federal government should enforce antitrust regulations on technology giants. So let's talk about the most important question. What is antitrust regulations, or what are antitrust laws? These laws are sometimes referred to as competition laws, and they allow for less power to be concentrated in particular marketplaces or by particular companies, and give greater voices to consumers, or in this case, the American people. And what these antitrust laws being enforced means is the government would essentially have the ability to intervene if a company, or in this case, a tech company becoming too big, or tech companies in a marketplace becoming too big, and tell them whether to split up or take particular sets of action which are in the best interest of the American people. And a lot of people argue this would be an actual good idea. The companies that we'd probably be talking about are the companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, the big names that essentially control most American technology, and a lot of the time control most technology available to the world. So the first question I know a lot of people might be having is government intervention. I thought the United States hates government intervention and is a supporter of free enterprise and allowing companies to do whatever they want. Now, in reality, that is generally the case in political rhetoric for like small corporations, but if you actually look to the history of the United States, the country throughout time has intervened when companies end up getting way too big and become too monopolistic. During industrialization, a lot of policies were passed in the late 19th century when railroad companies and steel companies essentially became way too big and started acquiring their competitors and then raising the prices of their goods, harming the American people, harming the American government, and making the country have to pay higher prices to do particular things on a product that was generally inelastic at the time. This essentially gave them a ton of power, and the United States saw as necessary to intervene, break these companies up, so that way they didn't have as much power. This wasn't just then, though. In 1982, the United States split up the telephone company, which you might find familiar, AT&T, to stop them from having too much power as well. In this situation, they broke up AT&T into 7 regional Baby Bell companies, and since then, the telecommunications market has become a lot more smaller, but is still a lot better off than it was then. More importantly, in 1999, a coalition of 19 states and the federal government sued Microsoft as they attempted to acquire a lot of competitors in order to maintain power. Now, in this situation, it didn't actually lead to Microsoft being broken up. Instead, it led to a settlement where Microsoft essentially settled so they would stop engaging in that type of behavior, and the government agreed that in that situation, they would not break them up. Today, companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, are engaging in similar practices as the steel companies, railroad companies, telecommunication companies in the past have participated in, by essentially acquiring their competitors so that way they can maintain the dominant technology giants in the market. Some argue this is a good thing because it allows for more innovation to actually take place, because you have a lot more concentrated profits in these companies, and companies like Google invest in AI technology and ways to increase life expectancy. Others argue that if they had competitors, they would have to make their product significantly better, which would allow for innovation to take place that way rather than just concentrated in these giants. And that's what largely this debate comes down to. Let's talk about framework a little bit, where the United States is today, why this topic is an actual topic, and why any of this matters whatsoever. So right now, there's a bipartisan effort for the government to intervene on these big tech giants like Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon. If you look at the Democratic primary, candidates like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Pete Buttigieg, and a lot of others have come out and said these companies are just way too big, and the government isn't doing anything to ensure that the data that they acquire isn't abused. But not only that, it's not only about data, it's also just about their products altogether. In this situation, it's a little bit different than it was in the past because they're not selling a good, they're just kind of collecting ad revenue on you. They're also getting a lot of data for you. So some argue antitrust law doesn't really apply to these companies because they're not selling anything to you. However, just because it doesn't necessarily apply doesn't necessarily mean that they don't need to follow antitrust laws because they're still gaining profits. It's just in a little bit of a different way than it was in the past. Markets evolve, but the general reasons why antitrust policies have been implemented probably can remain or probably still apply today. Buttigieg, Warren, Bernie Sanders, and these other Democrats argue that these companies can engage in practices like price discrimination and charge the poor versus the rich higher prices simply because the poor are likely to need more products more or for other reasons. Republicans have also come on board and supported a lot of policies to break up these big tech giants. Generally, it's on different premises than what the Democrats support. Republicans like Ted Cruz, Donald Trump, and Mitch McConnell have been critical of a lot of these companies from censoring conservative opinions. Largely, they usually look at companies like Facebook and argue that Facebook, YouTube, and these other social networks and argue that they're censoring a lot of conservative opinion because they're kicking off a lot of conservatives who engage in certain types of behavior that don't agree with Facebook's policies. That is important to think about on this topic simply because the Republicans still control the Senate and the White House. So a lot of people argue a con argument might actually be a really bad form of antitrust legislation getting passed because it will mean that more censorship will occur. It'll just occur onto Democrats as much as Republicans and might lead into some free speech violation arguments that you might encounter. Both sides have been very vocal that big tech is just way, way, way too big. Democrats are largely a lot louder on the issue, and you'll find that a lot more in literature, simply because of Russia's use of Facebook to push division in the United States during the 2016 election, but even more so, probably because the Democrats tend to rely on white, affluent, college-educated voters, so it seems as more of a priority in their eyes, rather than the Republicans. However, something else to realize that you'll probably see a lot more Republican backlash to these types of ideas simply because the Democratic debates, which will be happening in June, will largely drive the conversation, and Republicans might not be likely to agree, at least in the short term, to these ideas, in fact, being good and sticking to their free market principles simply because they think that'll be a good strategy to win over the American people. So that's something also to think about. All of this antitrust legislation, rhetoric, and discourse has been sped up by investments in AI technology, which a lot of people argue will allow for these companies to do some incredible things with data or some really, really scary things with data because it'll essentially allow for you to predict human behavior a lot more effectively. And the AI technology that's been invested in heavily by these tech giants will simply give a lot more power to these companies since they'll own the patents over to such technology, and it'll be a lot harder for the United States in the future to implement this type of policy after they get to a certain point, once they have too much power, or even if they can implement it in the future. It's more important for you to implement it now so that way the egregious abuses don't happen whatsoever. I talked about the Democratic primary is probably going to make this debate a lot more interesting because you'll be able to have a lot more discussion about what these antitrust legislation looks like because Democrats will propose ideas, Republicans will probably propose some ideas counter to the Democrats' ideas or not necessarily even support it whatsoever, but this gives you a good framework on what these policies might actually look like, whether they'll be good or whether they'll in fact not be good, or whether the policy will be agreed upon by the Democrats and the Republicans, and you can simply talk about the merits of that policy and whether it be advantageous to the American people and the American market. So now we're going to be talking about specific arguments. I think the pro is probably the easier side to debate on the topic, just because abuse is pretty apparent. What these tech companies are doing is generally not okay. However, that being said, there is still a lot of innovation that's also coming from these companies. That doesn't necessarily mean that there will continue to be innovation in the future. However, it does show you that right now there's good things and bad things happening. The question is whether the good things outweigh the bad things or the bad things outweigh the good things. First argument that'll probably be the most apparent one on the topic, probably the stockish issue, is there's no competition between these tech giants and small tech companies, simply because there's very little competition. Facebook, Google, Apple can just acquire these small companies, and what that does is means that they can just kind of squash competition, maintain power, and have less of an incentive to innovate. Opponents of that argument might say that allows for the innovation to happen even faster because these tech firms don't necessarily have the resources to create these new advantageous technologies that will be available to the American people. And by doing so, it'll allow for more innovation. Another argument people might talk about on this topic is we need to implement antitrust laws because tech companies are selling a lot of information on American citizens, and that's problematic because they're profiting off of like poor people. I'm not sure if there's some utilitarian impacts you can get coming out of that, but there are definitely some deontological ones where you can argue that this practice is just bad. You can also argue, I guess, in a utilitarian manner that through them selling this info, they are increasing their power and less likely to innovate, and it kind of operate as a magnifier of your impact if you're reading the argument we just talked about right before this one. A lot of ways you can spin these arguments. A different argument people might talk about is that data can actually be used against consumers. We talked about this a little bit before about price discrimination, and that through acquiring the American people's data, these companies can engage in practices that are abusive to their consumers. Opponents of this argument would argue that the free market still exists and people can still boycott these big companies. Opponents of that argument would essentially argue because these companies are the only ones providing the product, that it becomes a lot harder to boycott and doesn't really make a big difference, the backlash towards them. Another argument you can make on the pro is that because these companies are so big and they have so much data, that privacy breaches more easily occur. This can be true for a lot of reasons. One, little competition means that these companies have less reason to protect the consumer's data simply because there's no one else doing it, so they can kind of afford to have some sort of like breaches take place without people saying, oh no, I'm never going on Facebook again, and shifting over to Instagram, but when in reality, people not realizing that Facebook also owns Instagram, so it makes very little difference. Something else people could argue in regards to that argument is that when you have very little companies, it becomes a lot easier to hack just one company than when data is distributed across many different companies. Also, you could also make the argument that if these companies continue to grow at the same projected rate, that they will be the only companies available in the market, even if other company, or even if your opponents will say, oh, but what about this random social media company and this one, like Snapchat? They are increasing in power. If you're on the pro, you could argue that like Facebook is inquiring to buy out Snapchat and these other companies, and in reality that these companies are never going to be making as much money as the multi-billion-dollar company of Facebook that can simply buy out the smaller companies. So it's just a matter of time till they do that. That's why we need antitrust policies now. Okay, let's talk about some con arguments. A lot of people might argue that research and development will allow for progress to take place, and antitrust laws will harm the profits of these companies and stop them from being able to develop new technologies. Google, I know for a fact, and so is Facebook, is investing a lot in trying to cure cancer, investing a lot in medical artificial intelligence companies, and allowing for them to continue to grow will allow for these new innovations to take place. The question on this argument is whether big companies are better at innovating than small companies, or not better than innovating than small companies, but better innovating due to concentrated wealth or better innovating due to competition. The research is pretty mixed. I think a lot of it talks about that competition is in fact better. However, antitrust legislation can't break up companies too much to the fact where they are so weak that the innovation is limited. And that debate will largely come upon how you and your opponents agree this antitrust legislation will look like. Another argument people might make is that the United States, in order to maintain its hegemony in the tech industry, it needs a very unregulated market. That's probably a decent argument to be made, similar to the arguments that were made on the pharmaceutical topic, that the United States has the best tech companies simply because it doesn't break up the smaller, or simply because it doesn't break up its companies, and that allows for them to sell their iPhones, sell their MacBooks, sell their Androids, allow for Facebook to be available in other countries and Google to be available in other countries, and essentially spread Western influence. I think there are a lot of interesting arguments to come off of that one. Final argument we'll be talking about is that antitrust laws might actually trade off with a lot of wealth taxes in the status quo, because there's probably very limited political capital to like tax the rich or engage in to pass policies that restrict the very wealthy, simply because it'll lead to a lot of shocks in the stock market, especially when the economy is doing so well. So passing this type of policy now would stop maybe AOC's 70% income tax from actually being implemented, stop Bernie Sanders' policy that would allow for 4-year tuition-free college, or stop a lot of Elizabeth Warren's policies that give a lot to the American people. Also, you could also argue it trades off with policies like Andrew Yang's universal basic income, which a lot of candidates in the Democratic election or in the Democratic primary have actually come on in support of, or supporting some sort of kind of policy that looks like that. It could trade off simply because there's limited political capital, limited bipartisan support, or simply because the economy is doing so well right now, and implementing a ton of progressive policies at once might shock the economy or cause problems in the marketplace that would scare companies from investing, causing a recession or depression. So there are a lot of arguments to talk about on this topic. I hope this video helped. I encourage you to check out the Champion Briefs, subscribe to the brief, check out more of these videos. I hope you have I hope NSDA goes well for you. Thanks so much for watching.